Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Before we get into tonight's game, I wanted to ask a question. Do you have extra cards lying around that you don't use? Want to buy or trade for some extra cards but don't know how to maximize the value? Then you should try out today's sponsor, Card Conduit. Card Conduit is the best service when it comes to selling your extra cards. Don't waste hours trying to find the best buy list price for your cards online. Simply send them to Card Conduit and let them take care of the rest. I have used Card Conduit multiple times already. I always use them to get the best value for my extra cards. I get fair prices for my cards and they save me tons of time. They have three main services. Their standard service lets you send them your unsorted cards of any value. They will sort, grade, and give you the best price for your cards. Their curated service is similar. Send them your unsorted cards worth over $1 in value. They will charge half the fee of the standard service and charge no fee per card. Their sorted service is a great value as well. Choose cards in advance with their selection tool, send them sorted to Card Conduit, and they will grade and buy list them automatically. Save yourself the time of having to send to multiple sites and let Card Conduit do it instead. Their fee is only 2% with no fee per card. They give you the best price for your cards. They work with competitive buy listing partners, including ones not open to the public. Users get an average of 19% more for their collection than they would from any major retail buy list, even with Card Conduit's fees. Card Conduit also optimizes buy listing for card condition as well. Since vendors have different penalties for wear and tear, Card Conduit will find the best buy list priced against the specific condition of the card. So give Card Conduit a try today. If you sign up with my link in the description below or use the promo code POWER, you will also get 10% off of their fees when you use their service. A big thanks to Card Conduit for sponsoring today's video. Now, let's start out by showcasing our fighters this evening. First, we have John piloting Azami, Lady of Scrolls. This mono blue wizard deck aims to draw all of the cards and finish the game with a Laboratory Maniac. John's opening hand contains a Cavern of Souls, Polluted Delta, Scalding Tarn, Brainstorm, Force of Negation, Baral, Chief of Compliance, and a Soul Ring. Next, we have Zach piloting Niv-Mizzet Perun. This deck wants to control the board and play its commander as soon as possible, then combo with Curiosity. Zach's opening hand contains an Island, Lotus Petal, Urza Saga, Phantasmal Image, Ophidian Eye, Force of Will, and a Dockside Extortionist. After that, we have Brandon piloting Marwyn the Nurturer. This elf deck wants to use its commander to generate massive amounts of mana and then snowball into a win. Brandon's opening hand contains two forests, Elvish Mystic, Vines of Vastwood, Woodland Bellower, Prismatic Vista, and his London Mulligan is a forest. Finally, we have Zeb piloting Inalla, Archmage Ritualist. As if one wizard deck wasn't enough, this wizard deck is looking to use its commander's Eminence ability to gain value off of the wizards entering the battlefield and then eventually win with an ETB-centered combo. Zeb's opening hand contains a Dark Ritual, Misty Rainforest, Talisman of Creativity, Aether Channeler, Morphic Pool, and his two London Mulligans are Tainted Pact and Brain Freeze. Without further ado, let's kick off this daringly dubious dance of decks. John wins the sleepover pillow fight and gets to start us off. John draws and plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Wizard as it enters. He casts a Soul Ring, he passes. Zach draws and plays an Island. He casts a Lotus Petal, he ends his turn. Brandon draws and plays a Prismatic Vista. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a forest onto the battlefield. He casts an Elvish Mystic. He ships the turn to Zeb. Zeb draws, plays a Misty Rainforest, and passes. John draws and taps his Cavern of Souls to help cast an uncounterable Baral, Chief of Compliance. He plays a Polluted Delta. He gives the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He ships the turn. At the end of Zach's turn, Zeb cracks his Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. Brandon draws and plays a forest. He casts his commander, Marwyn the Nurturer. He passes. Zeb draws and plays a Morphic Pool. He casts Talisman of Creativity. He ends his turn. At the end of Zeb's turn, John cracks his Polluted Delta, pays a life, and fetches up a snow-covered island onto the battlefield. He casts Brainstorm, drawing 3 and putting 2 back on top. The turn moves to John. John draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an island onto the battlefield. He casts a Lotus Petal. He taps his Cavern of Souls to help cast his commander, Azami, Lady of Scrolls. He activates Azami, tapping her to draw a card. He activates her again, tapping Baral to draw a card. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He gives the turn to Zach. At the end of John's turn, Zach casts Snap, targeting Azami. In response, John casts Dispel, targeting Snap. In response, Zeb taps his Talisman to cast Swan Song, targeting Dispel. Swan Song resolves, Dispel is countered, and John creates a 2/2 bird. Snap then resolves, Azami is bounced, and Zach untaps 2 lands. The turn moves to Zach. Zach draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He casts Mystic Remora. In response, John casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card, targeting Remora. In response, Zach casts Force of Will, paying a life, and exiling a blue card, targeting Force of Negation. Force of Negation is countered, and Mystic Remora resolves. Zach casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Zach creates 2 whole treasures. The table asks what he's going to do with all that coin, and Zach tells them that he's going to pass the turn. Brandon draws and plays a forest. He casts a kicked Vines of Vastwood, targeting Marwyn. Remora triggers, and Zach draws. Vines resolves and Marwyn gets +4/+4. He taps Marwyn for 5 green and then casts Shared Summons. Remora triggers, Zach draws, and then Brandon fetches up a Shia, Soul of the Wild, and a Wirewood Symbiote into his hand. He casts Wirewood Symbiote. He taps his Elvish Mystic, floating a green, and then activates Wirewood Symbiote, returning Mystic to hand, untapping Marwyn. He recasts Elvish Mystic. It enters, and Marwyn gets a +1/+1 counter. He taps Marwyn for 6 green. He casts Woodland Bellower. In response, Zeb casts a very dangerous Pact of Negation. Remora triggers and Zach draws. Pact resolves and Bellower is countered. Brandon ships the turn to Zeb. During Zeb's upkeep, Pact of Negation triggers. He doesn't have enough mana to pay, so in response, he casts Dark Ritual and Zach draws. Then Zeb adds 3 black and taps his Talisman to help pay for Pact of Negation. The table admires Zeb's bravery as he draws for turn. He plays a Crystal Vein and passes. John draws and plays an island. He taps his Cavern of Souls to help cast Azami, Lady of Scrolls. He taps her to draw a card. He taps Baral to draw a card. He passes. During its upkeep, Zach pays to keep his Remora. He draws, and in his first main phase, Urza's Saga gets a final counter, and he sacrifices it. He fetches up a Jeweled Lotus onto the battlefield. He cracks it to help cast his commander, Niv-Mizzet. He ends his turn. Brandon draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps Ancient Tomb and floats mana from his other permanents. He activates Wirewood Symbiote, bouncing Elvish Mystic to untap Marwyn. He recasts Elvish Mystic. It enters and gives Marwyn a counter. He casts Invasion of Ikoria, where X equals 7, targeting Zeb. Remora triggers and Zach draws. Niv triggers and deals 1 damage to Wirewood Symbiote, killing it. In response, Zach casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Invasion. Niv triggers, Zach draws, and Niv pings Elvish Mystic, killing it. Fierce Guardianship resolves and Invasion is countered. Brandon gives the turn to Zeb. Zeb draws and casts Aether Channeler. It enters and bounces Niv-Mizzet. Innalla's Eminence triggers and Zeb pays 1 to create a token copy of Channeler with haste. It enters and bounces Azami. Zeb moves to combat and attacks Brandon with his Channeler copy. Brandon takes the hit, Zeb ends his turn, exiling the Channeler. John draws and plays a Reliquary Tower. He taps his Cavern of Souls to help recast Azami. He taps her to draw a card. He taps Baral to draw a card. He gives the turn to Zach. During Zach's upkeep, he lets his Mystic Remora die. He draws and casts Ponder. He looks at the top 3, rearranges, and draws. He plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts Red Elemental Blast, targeting Azami. In response, John casts Force of Will, paying a life, exiling a blue card, targeting Red Blast. In response, Zach casts Misdirection, exiling a blue card, targeting Force of Will. Misdirection resolves and changes the target of Force of Will to Misdirection itself. Force of Will fizzles and Red Elemental Blast resolves, killing Azami. Zach passes the turn. Brandon draws and plays a Forest. He casts Mana Vault. He ships the turn to Zeb. Zeb draws and, liking what Brandon did this turn, casts his own Mana Vault. He passes. John draws and casts Merchant Scroll, fetching up a Frantic Search into his hand. He casts Frantic Search. He draws 2, discards 2, and untaps 3 lands. He uses his blue from his Cavern of Souls to cast Trinket Mage. It enters and he fetches up a Mana Crypt into his hand. He casts Mana Crypt. John ends his turn. Zach draws and plays an island. He ships the turn to Brandon. Brandon draws and taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast a Shia, Soul of the Wild. He moves to combat and attacks Zeb with Marwyn. Zeb takes the hit and Brandon passes the turn. At the end of Brandon's turn, Zeb casts Essence Flux, targeting his Aether Channeler. Channeler blinks, Zeb draws a card, and Innalla's Eminence triggers, Zeb pays 1, creates a copy of Channeler, it enters, and Zeb draws again. The turn moves to Zeb. Zeb draws and casts Talisman of Indulgence. He passes, and his Channeler copy is exiled. During its upkeep, John loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and then taps his Cavern of Souls to help cast Azami, Lady of Scrolls. In response, Zach delves 6 to help cast Dig Through Time. He looks at the top 7, putting 2 into his hand and the rest on bottom. Then Azami resolves. John taps Azami to draw a card. He taps Trinket Mage to draw a card. He taps Baral to draw a card. He plays an island for turn. He ships the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Steam Vents onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Phantasmal Image. In response, John casts Mana Drain, targeting Image. In response, Zach casts Miscast, targeting Mana Drain. Miscast resolves, Mana Drain is countered, and then Phantasmal Image resolves. It enters as a copy of Dockside Extortionist, and Zach creates 6 treasures. He recasts his commander, Niv-Mizzet. In response, Zeb taps his Talisman to help cast Ad Nauseam. With no answers, Ad Naus resolves. Zeb reveals the Thassa's Oracle, Steam Vents, Rhystic Study, Blue Elemental Blast, Arid Mesa, Force of Will, Vampiric Tutor, Rite of Flame, and a Dockside Extortionist, deciding to stop there. Then Niv-Mizzet resolves. Zach ends his turn. Brandon draws and casts a Summoner's Pact. Zach draws through Niv-Mizzet and pings Azami for 1. Summoner's Pact resolves and Brandon fetches up an Eternal Witness into his hand. He casts Eternal Witness. In response, Zeb casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Witness. Niv triggers and Zach draws, then pings Azami again, killing her. Force of Will resolves and Eternal Witness is countered. Brandon gives the turn to Zeb. During Zeb's upkeep, he casts Vampiric Tutor. Niv triggers and then Zach draws, then pings Zeb for 1. In response, Brandon taps his Ancient Tomb to help hardcast Invigorate, targeting Marwyn. Zach draws through Niv and pings Zeb. Invigorate resolves, giving Marwyn +4/+4 until the end of turn. Still in response, Zeb casts Blue Elemental Blast targeting Niv. Zack draws through Niv and then pings Zeb, then Blue Elemental Blast resolves, destroying Niv-Mizzet Perun. Then Vampiric Tutor resolves and Zeb fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He draws, and during his draw step, he takes a damage through his mana vault. He plays a Steam Vents into play untapped, paying 2 life. He taps his Talisman to help cast Thassa's Oracle. In response, John casts Pact of Negation targeting Thoracle. Pact resolves, Oracle is countered, Baral triggers, and then John draws and discards. Next, Zeb taps his Talisman to help cast Dockside Extortionist. It enters and Zeb creates 3 treasures. He does the unthinkable and casts Simian Spirit Guide. Zeb passes the turn. During his upkeep, John wins his Mana Crypt roll and then pays for his Pact of Negation. Still in his upkeep, he casts Mystical Tutor, fetching up a Temporal Mastery onto the top of his library. He draws Temporal Mastery and casts it for his Miracle cost, getting an extra turn. He plays a Cephalid Colosseum. He moves to combat and attacks Zeb with his bird. Zeb takes the hit, and John passes the turn to, well, himself. During his upkeep, John loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and then activates his Cephalid Colosseum, sacrificing it to draw 3 and discard 3. He moves to combat and attacks Zeb with his bird. Zeb takes the hit, and in his second main phase, John casts Capture of Jingxiao, taking an extra turn. John gives the turn to himself. Again. During his upkeep, John loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Zeb with his bird. Zeb takes the hit, and in his second main phase, John casts a Time Twister. Each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library, then draws 7. John casts Teferi's Ageless Insight. He casts a Brainstorm. He draws 6 cards through Ageless Insight, and then puts 2 back on top. He casts a Lotus Petal. He plays a Cephalid Colosseum. He taps his Colosseum to help cast Merchant Scroll. He fetches up a Frantic Search into his hand. He casts Frantic Search, drawing 4, discarding 2, and untapping 2 of his lands. He casts Snapcaster Mage. It enters, giving Frantic Search flashback. John flashes back Frantic Search from his graveyard, drawing 4, discarding 2, and untapping 3 lands. He casts Mistcaller. Unable to produce a victory, he reluctantly ends his turn. Zack draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He casts a Brainstorm. He draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. He cracks his Wooded Foothills, pays a life, and fetches up a mountain onto the battlefield. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Graph Digger's Cage. He casts a Goblin Engineer. It enters, and he fetches up a Jeweled Lotus into his graveyard. He gives the turn to Brandon. At the end of Zack's turn, Brandon casts Worldly Tutor. In response, John casts Dispel, targeting Tutor. Worldly Tutor is countered, Baral triggers, John draws 2 through Teferi's Ageless Insight, and then discards a card. The turn moves to Brandon. During its upkeep, Brandon taps his Ancient Tomb to help pay for his Summoner's Pact. He draws and casts Teamer Sabertooth. In response, John casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card targeting Teamer Sabertooth. Force of Will resolves, Sabertooth is countered, Baral triggers, then John draws 2 and discards a card. Next, Brandon casts Hyrex Tower Scout. He casts Priest of Titania. It enters, and Marwyn gets a counter. He casts Wirewood Symbiote. He moves to combat and attacks Zeb with a Shia. Zeb blocks with Simian Spirit Guide dies, and then Brandon ends his turn. During his upkeep, Zeb sacrifices his Crystal Vein to help untap his mana vault. He then casts a Mystical Tutor, fetching up a Step Through onto the top of his library. He draws for turn and plays an Underground Sea. He Wizard cycles Step Through, discarding it and fetching up a Scholar of Ages into his hand. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Dockside as an additional cost, adding 4 black. He casts Scholar of Ages. In response, John activates the Cephalid Colosseum, sacrificing it, drawing 6, and discarding 3. He casts Pact of Negation, targeting Scholar. Scholar is countered, Baral triggers, John draws 2, and discards a card. With nothing else, Zeb ships the turn. During his upkeep, John wins his Mana Crypt roll and then pays for his Pact of Negation. He draws and casts Phantasmal Image. In response, Zack casts Delay, targeting Image. In response, John casts Swansong, targeting Delay. In response, Zack casts Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Swansong. Swansong is countered, and still in response, John casts his own Delay, targeting Zack's Delay. Delay resolves, Zack's Delay is countered and exiled with 3 time counters on it. Baral triggers, and John draws 2 and discards a card. Then Phantasmal Image resolves and enters as a copy of Dockside Extortionist. John creates 7 treasures. He casts Fabricate, fetching up a Jeweled Lotus into his hand. He casts Jeweled Lotus. He cracks it to help cast his commander, Azami. He taps his Trinket Mage through Azami to draw 2. He taps Baral to draw 2. He taps Mistcaller to draw 2. He taps Azami to draw 2. He taps Snapcaster to, you guess it, draw 2. He pays 2 life to cast Gitaxian Probe. He looks at Zack's hand and then draws 2 cards. He moves to combat and attacks Zeb with his bird. Zeb takes it and dies. In his second main phase, John plays an island. He casts Curse Catcher. He taps it through Azami to draw 2. With quite a healthy hand, he passes the turn to Zack. During Zack's upkeep, he removes the time counter from a delay, and then wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays an island. He activates Goblin Engineer, sacrificing his Mana Crypt to return Jeweled Lotus to the battlefield. He recasts Niv-Mizzet Perun. He ends his turn. During his draw step, Brandon takes a damage through his mana vault. He plays a Wooded Foothills for turn. He taps his Ancient Doom to help cast Force of Vigor, targeting Grafdigger's Cage and Teferi's Ageless Insight. Niv triggers, Zach draws, and then he targets Curse Catcher with the ping. In response, John activates Curse Catcher, sacrificing it, targeting Force of Vigor. Brandon pays for the Curse Catcher, Niv's ping fizzles, and still in response, John casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card and targeting Force of Vigor. Niv triggers, Zach draws, and Niv pings Snapcaster Mage, killing it. In response, Brandon casts Invigorate for its alternate cost, having Zach gain 4 life and targeting Marwyn. Zach draws and pings Wirewood Symbiote through Niv, killing it. Invigorate resolves, giving Marwyn +4/+4 until the end of turn. Force of Negation finally resolves, countering and exiling Force of Vigor. Baral triggers and John draws 2 and discards 1. Brandon moves to combat and attacks John with a Shia. John chump blocks with Dockside Extortionist, it dies, and then Brandon ships the turn to John. At the end of Brandon's turn, Zach casts Rapid Hybridization, targeting Azami. Zach draws through Niv-Mizzet and pings Mistcaller with the ping. In response, John activates Mistcaller, sacrificing it, fizzling the ping. In response to her hybridization, John pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, targeting hybridization. Zach draws and pings Trinket Mage through Niv-Mizzet. In response, Zach casts Submerge for its alternate cost, targeting Baral. Zach draws and pings Trinket Mage with Niv, killing it. Submerge resolves and bounces Baral to the top of his library. Still in response, Zach then casts Miscast, targeting Mental Misstep. Zach draws and pings John with Niv. In response, John casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, targeting Zach's spells. Zach draws and pings John through Niv. In response, Zach casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting Mindbreak Trap. Zach draws and pings John through Niv again. Deflecting Swat resolves and changes the targets of Mindbreak Trap to Mental Misstep. Mindbreak Trap resolves, Mental Misstep is exiled, Miscast fizzles, Rapid Hybridization resolves, Azami is destroyed, and John creates a 3/3 Frog Lizard. After all that, the turn finally moves to John. During his upkeep, John loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He moves to combat and attacks Brandon with his bird. Brandon takes the hit, and in his second main phase, John taps his Cavern of Souls to help cast Cyclone Summoner. It enters and returns all non-giant, non-wizard, non-land permanents to their owner's hands. John delves 8 to help cast Temporal Trespass. Zach draws and pings John through Niv, and then Temporal Trespass resolves. John casts Sapphire Medallion. He casts the Soul Ring. John passes to himself. John draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He casts Capture of Jing Chao. Zach draws and pings John through Niv. John casts Evacuation. Zach draws and pings John through Niv again, and then all creatures are bounced to their owner's hand. John plays an island. He casts Intruder Alarm. He passes the turn to himself. John draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga triggers. He floats mana and sacrifices it, fetching up a Mox Opal onto the battlefield. He casts Nexus of Fate. John gets an extra turn and shuffles Nexus back into his library. He casts Baral, Chief of Compliance. He casts Teferi's Ageless Insight. He casts Library of Ling. He gives the turn to himself, completing a full John turn cycle. John draws and casts Mind Over Matter. He casts a Mana Crypt. He activates Mind Over Matter, discarding a card to untap a snow-covered island. He taps his Cavern of Souls to help cast Azami, Lady of Scrolls. He presents a loop of tapping Azami to draw 2 cards through Teferi's Ageless Insight, discarding a card to untap her through Mind Over Matter, and then repeating this until he has drawn his whole library. He discards 2 cards through Mind Over Matter to untap 2 lands, and then he casts Laboratory Maniac. He taps Laboratory Maniac through Azami to draw 2 cards, and with no cards left in his library, John wins the game. Ladies and gentlemen, what a great game tonight. Congrats to John on his win. While it took some time, and by time we mean time walks, John was able to finally close out the game. He was able to control the board and fight through plenty of interaction. It was through his extra turns that he assembled an amazing draw engine to finally close it out. The most valuable card in tonight's game, sponsored by Luxury Playstyle, goes to Teferi's Ageless Insight. This card helped John dig so much deeper than normal. His draw engines, including his commander, were amplified so much because of this card. We rarely ever see this card in a CEDH setting, and we were so happy to see it tonight. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. Tune in next time when we duke it out to see who will be king of the competitive EDH table. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.